So our first speaker, Dr. Alison Sheridan, is Emerita Principal Curator and still Research Associate with the National Museums of Scotland in Edinburgh. And of course, as many of you know, is a past president of the Prehistoric Society. Dr. Sheridan has received many awards and accolades, including the British Academy Graham Clark Medal in 2018 for outstanding work in prehistoric archaeology, and in 2020 delivered the prestigious Rind Lectures in the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. And in that same year, to cap it all, she was voted Archaeologist of the Year by the vote readers of Current Archaeology. Alison is one of Europe's foremost prehistorians, a very, very long and distinguished career in both research and extensive publications. And these have been largely concerned, not exclusively, largely concerned with the Neolithic and Bronze Age, especially of Ireland and Britain, and with a particular expertise in ceramics and stone axes, and in what archaeologists sometimes refer to euphemistically as personal adornments, which Alison, I think, usually refers to as jewellery, which is precisely what it is, especially jewellery made of jet, of amber, of gold, and of faience. Her Irish work alone has, and continues to be, instrumental in establishing the foundations of modern scholarship in all of these areas. This afternoon, she's going to explore with us the extent and nature of Ireland's connections with the wider world over the Neolithic, the Chalcolithic, and the early Bronze Age. You do know you've only got 35 minutes. In her presentation entitled Ireland in the Wider Prehistoric World, 4,300 to 1,500 BC. Dr. Alison Sheridan.
Thanks very, very much, Owen. 5 is in the post. And thanks to Una and Sharon for giving me the very great honour and privilege of participating in such a fabulous and stimulating conference in honour of George Ogan, a veritable colossus of Irish archaeology, who was unfailingly kind and generous to me. I mean, he is very, very much missed. And thanks too to all of my wonderful chums, who have, including, of course, Ken Williams, who has generously allowed me to reproduce their images in my talk. Yes, it falls to me to consider the wider world in which Ireland's Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and early Bronze Age inhabitants lived, looking at the many and varied ways in which their lives were intertwined with those of people across the water. And in a conference dedicated to celebrating the massive achievements of Professor Ogan, there's no better way than to start with an image of this weird and wonderful stone object, which of course you've seen before, the so-called idol found outside the Western Passage tomb in the main monument at Naas. It was George who realised that this particular object, which could arguably be a stylised representation of a divine being, may have travelled, or the idea of it, may have travelled over 1,500 kilometres as the crow flies. Since the closest, as Elizabeth pointed out, the closest and indeed the only comparanda are to be found in Portugal, around the mouth of the Tagus River, where Lisbon is now. This was, and remains, a pretty mind-blowing discovery, one of many, which reminds us just how sophisticated, well-connected, and moreover navigationally skilled were the people who are responsible for building the major passage tombs of the Boyne Valley. The reason for this extraordinarily long-distance movement relates to the specific power politics of the time, around 3,200 BC, in which the undertaking of long and perilous sea journeys and the bringing back of exotic ideas, objects, and practices was a fundamental part of the strategy of maintaining and enhancing the power of the elite, a topic to which I shall return. But this was just one of many different ways in which the lives of Ireland's inhabitants were connected to those of people across the sea, over the 2.5 millennia from around 4,300 BC to around 1750 BC. And what I hope to do in this broad brush review of the evidence is to give you little snapshots or case studies highlighting who or what was travelling, from where to where, and why. And the eagle-eyed among you will see that I've changed my end date from 1500 BC to 1750, put that down to inflation or the collapse of the pound or whatever, or rather the realization I'm never going to get through it all otherwise. My first case study concerns the way in which the farming way of life came to be established in Ireland. And I hasten to add that the photo wasn't taken at the time, nor does it necessarily reflect the size of the skin-covered boats that are likely to have been used. And I'm delighted that Mary Cahill showed a picture of the much larger seagoing curraghs, which are more likely to be the thing. This sedentary way of life, featuring the production of food using domesticated animals and plants, was fundamentally different from that of Ireland's indigenous Mesolithic inhabitants, who relied on exploiting wild resources through hunting, fishing, and foraging, moving around the landscape as particular resources came into season. Many of you will be aware of a heated and long-standing argument about how farming came to Ireland and Britain, with some, including myself, arguing that it was introduced by immigrant farming groups from the continent, while others argue that Ireland's Mesolithic inhabitants chose to adopt it, having made regular trips to the continent, where they witnessed this weird new way of life, which contrasted so starkly with their own. The only thing on which the factions can agree is that the nuts and bolts of farming, the domesticated cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, and the wheat, barley, and flax must have been physically transported over the sea from the continent, as the wild progenitors of these species simply don't exist in Ireland, and we know that wild boar that did exist were not domesticated here. The same goes for the practice of making pottery, a continental technology wholly alien to Mesolithic Ireland, and to other aspects of the Neolithic way of life. Thanks to the fabulous recent ancient DNA work done by Lara Cassidy and Dan Bradley here in Trinity College and by their colleagues elsewhere, the answer is now plain for all of us to see. Yes, we are indeed dealing with the arrival of immigrant farming communities from the continent, many of whom will probably have looked different from Ireland's indigenous inhabitants, being slightly lighter skinned. Moreover, Lara and Dan's genetic research has concluded that Irish Mesolithic communities were profoundly insular, their genetic signatures showing that they had effectively been cut off from Britain and the continent for millennia. And despite some unconvincing claims to the contrary, their material culture and their funerary practices show no sign whatsoever of interactions with elsewhere, with the sole possible exception of the Isle of Man. And so I'm afraid I simply don't buy the idea of Irish hunter-fisher-foragers regularly setting off in their boats to visit the continent. Whereas if you look at what continental farmers were getting up to during the 5th millennium, especially in Brittany, you will see that there is plentiful evidence for long-distance deep-sea sailing. So here is my model of how farming came to be established in Ireland and Britain. It wasn't a single or indeed a massive episode of migration, but rather several episodes or processes differing in scale from each other, where variable numbers of farmers came from different parts of the northern half of France to different parts of our archipelago for different reasons and with differing responses from the locals. The 3 strands that affected Ireland are indicated by the red arrows. The first one, top left, seems to have been a bit of a false start, which can be described in a nutshell, appropriately enough, like this. Picture the scene. It's a fine, sunny day around 4350 BC in a Mesolithic campsite at Ferriter's Cove in County Kerry. A few strangers had appeared in the area recently with some funny new animals which looked good to hunt and eat, which is just exactly what happened, resulting in the bones of domesticated cattle ending up on their hearth. These people were not remotely interested in learning how to farm, and the incoming farmers from northwest France and their animals had not come over in sufficient numbers to constitute a critical mass so that they could establish themselves. And so we see a very rapid end to the Neolithic in this part of Ireland at that particular time, and an early case of cowboys versus First Nation folks. This is a caricature, of course, but I haven't come across a more plausible reading of the Ferriter's Cove evidence. The second strand of Neolithization, arriving from the Morbihan area of Brittany, as shown by the star on this map, probably around 4000 BC, brought to the north coast of Ireland and to Western Britain the Breton tradition of burying the dead in megalithic funerary monuments. And in Ireland and Scotland, the simple small monuments that you see here stand at the beginning of long and complex sequences of passage tomb evolution that culminated in Ireland in the massive passage tombs of the Boyne Valley and indeed elsewhere. Confirmation that people were indeed coming from Brittany is offered not just in the design and architecture of these monuments, but also by the Breton-style late Castellic pot that was found in the monument at Achnacreebeag on the west coast of Scotland. As for why people should have upped sticks in Brittany to sail northwards to an unknown destination, we have to consider the changes that had been going on in Breton society in preceding centuries, with the collapse around 4300 BC of one very macho social system based on the dominance of a few so-called god-kings, to use Serge Cassen's term, and its replacement by a different social order. There's no time to go into detail about that, but Serge Cassen has written at length on this topic. The third strand of Neolithization, featuring the arrival, ultimately from Nord-Pas de Calais, but probably via northern Britain, of different groups of immigrant farmers from northern France, apparently coming in considerable numbers. This movement was ultimately occasioned by population pressure and build-up in the Paris Basin, which led, from 4300 BC onwards, to people expanding out from there, with some going to Nord-Pas de Calais and thence to Britain and Ireland. The DNA data back up this scenario. These people brought a funerary tradition featuring the placing of the dead within timber mortuary structures, as you can see at the bottom left of this slide, and also of open-air cremation. And both of these practices are actually represented in the north of Ireland. The mortuary structures, which were eventually encased in long trapezoidal mounds, were the origins of both court tombs and portal tombs in Ireland, I would argue. These incomers also brought the tradition of building rectangular houses, like the huge communal version that you see here in Aberdeenshire. In County Sligo, there's evidence suggesting that a goodly number of these immigrants were present at least as early as 4000 BC, as suggested, for example, by a large enclosure site at Macroboy. Among the continental novelties brought by these people were these superb axe heads made from jadeite, originating in the North Italian Alps. The small fragment of a deliberately broken axe head from Trianborn in County Galway recently came to light thanks to the eagle eye of Ross O'Muldoon. These were not just everyday axe heads for chopping down trees. Rather, they were precious sacred objects, green treasures from the magic mountains far away, used in a purely ceremonial way. Thanks to a major international French-led research project, Projet Jade, we know exactly where they originated, and we also know that they will have been old, up to several centuries old, when they were deposited in Ireland. This map by Projet Jade shows the source areas on Monte Viso near Turin and Monte Begua above Genoa, and the distribution of large axe heads of jadeite and other alpine rocks right across Europe. You can also see a block of jadeite with the Monte Viso peak behind it. Neolithic people may well have associated mountains with the gods, believing that objects made from mountain rock were imbued with the special divine powers. The axe heads found in Ireland will have travelled up to 1,800 kilometres from their sources during their long lives, but not directly. They will have circulated for some time in northern France before being brought over by the pioneering farming groups from there as precious communal heirlooms, some of them polished to a glassy sheen to maximize their magical protective powers, which would have been needed during the risky sea crossings. Moving on rapidly to my second case study, I want to focus on the regular toing and froing across and around and up and down the Irish Sea that took place between these farming communities throughout much of the 4th millennium. This axe from Chalcolithic in the Outer Hebrides, with its axe head of Antrim porcelainite, is the poster boy or girl for this kind of interaction. And it shows that the existence of the sea was not a barrier to the extensive networks of social interaction that were rapidly established by the farmers and over which desirable things, resources, people, and ideas circulated. Particularly close links can be seen between northeast Ireland and southwest Scotland, despite the fact that the currents in the North Channel can be treacherous. We can see these links, for example, in the shared design of these megalithic monuments that are known as Clyde cairns in southwest Scotland and as court tombs in Ireland. These represent a translation into stone of the timber mortuary structures and their cairns that we saw before. And we know from radiocarbon dating programs that they came into being around 3750 BC on both sides of the Irish Sea. Other evidence for these close links includes items of Antrim flint that have been found in southwest Scotland, as in this magnificent hoard found near Campbelltown. Finds of Arran pitchstone, which is a volcanic glass in northeast Ireland, including this one from Napan, which I found about 1 million years ago on the last day of the dig. And also in the design of the pottery that's found in several court tombs and Clyde cairns. Interestingly, these decorated bowls with their rainbow motifs are the ceramic descendants, if you like, of the Breton-style bowl from Achnacreebeag that we saw a few slides ago. There's evidence for further flung contacts to the north as well, linking Ireland to the Hebrides, several days' sail away, in the form of these sherds of Hebridean-style jars found on the sandhills at Portstewart, and by the Antrim porcelainite axe heads found at Chalcolithic on Lewis and indeed elsewhere. The sources of this particular rock are Teaghbullia and Brockley on Rathlin Island. Further south, there's plentiful evidence for connections across the Irish Sea to Wales and to southwest England, as you can see, for example, in the distribution of portal tombs, a distinctive type of megalithic monument whose origins, like those of court tombs, can be traced back to the timber mortuary structures of the earliest Neolithic. While the Cornish and Welsh ones are poorly dated, we know, thanks to Anne Lynch's work, that Paul na Brone was in use as early as around 3800 BC. And there were, of course, connections with northwest England and the Isle of Man as well, shown for instance in the axe heads made of tuff from Great Langdale in Cumbria that ended up in Ireland. My next case study about the external connections of the people responsible for the construction of the major passage tombs of the Boyne Valley takes us on several very long journeys and introduces us to the concept of elite travel for the purposes of what the anthropologist Mary Helms has referred to as cosmological acquisition. That's a fancy term to describe how certain privileged people would undertake heroic long-distance journeys, bringing back esoteric knowledge and exotic objects as part of an elite power play to underline their own importance and to get one over on their rivals. To cut a very long and complex story short, essentially Newgrange, Knowth and Dowth, and other huge passage tombs in Ireland represent the culmination of a centuries-long process of monumental aggrandisement, a case of competitive, conspicuous consumption on the monuments to house the dead, where the leading groups in Neolithic society vied to create the most splendid and imposing monument for the members of their family or group, however, in whichever way kinship was constituted. We can see this process, for example, in the passage tomb cemeteries at Carrowmore and Knocknarea in Sligo, with the massive Queen Maeve's cairn, which could have been roughly contemporary with the Boyne Valley mega passage tombs dominating the landscape. I and others have suggested in the past that this process of aggrandisement reflected an increasingly inegalitarian society, not least because the amassing of materials and labour to build a massive passage tomb, as we heard from Kerry this morning, and at Newgrange, the designing of the monument so that the rays of the rising sun would run along the passage and into the chamber at midwinter solstice will have required very careful planning and leadership and organisation. And while it has become fashionable in some quarters to play down the notion of elites in Irish or Irish Neolithic or British Neolithic society, I personally find it incomprehensible that monuments such as Newgrange, Knowth and Douth could have been built as the communal project of an egalitarian society. Interestingly, support for the idea of aggrandised passage tombs being an expression of elite power comes from the genetic work recently undertaken by Clara Cassidy and Dan Bradley. One of their key findings is that there are familial links between passage tomb builders across long distances within Ireland and over many generations. This could indeed suggest that the building of aggrandised passage tombs was the preserve of a narrow spectrum of Neolithic society. Moreover, at Newgrange, the concept of keeping it in the family was taken to the extreme, with the burial of a man who was the offspring of an incestuous coupling. Marrying within the family is a known strategy of different kinds of elites around the world and across time, and indeed is not unknown among Western aristocracies in the recent past. As a strategy, incest is one way of maintaining the purity of the bloodline. It would appear that, around 3200 BC, part of the power play strategy of the groups responsible for constructing the three major Boyne Valley monuments involved travelling to the Morbihan area of Brittany and further afield down to Iberia, as we've heard from Elizabeth, to visit the megalithic funerary monuments there and to join in the seasonal celebrations and to acquire esoteric knowledge and exotica to bring home. We can see this, for example, in the way that the Western tomb at Knowth featured the addition of a long passage at a slight angle to what had probably been, well, we can say now certainly, a small pre-existing passage tomb. This made it resemble the allées coudées, or angled passage tombs, of the Morbihan, and there can be little doubt that it was a quite deliberate design feature, an emulation of Breton monuments, rather than a chance misalignment of the passage and chamber. We can also see it, as we've seen before, in the very striking and distinctive so-called guardian goddess figure that appears to be guarding the entrance to the chamber at Knowth West. And as Elizabeth pointed out, this bears more than the passing resemblance to similar figures found in the angled passage tombs of Le Lufang and Les Pierres Plates. And here, fools rush in. It may be that the design in all three monuments features a more or less abstract image of a vulva with eyes above it, suggesting that a female powerful deity is represented. And a third feature, which suggests the Boyne Valley so-called passage tomb people had seen the passage tombs of the Morbihan, is the dense, high-relief style, which Elizabeth has mentioned in her talk, and has pointed out that similarly dense and high-relief designs can be seen on the passage tomb at Gavrinis, which will have been several centuries old by the time a visiting grandee from the Boyne Valley visited it. Moreover, as we noted at the beginning of this talk, the Boyne Valley elite's long-distance voyaging extended as far as Iberia, as we can see from this tiny, foot-shaped carved pebble from Newgrange that finds its parallels among the Argalo-type idols of northwest Spain, and by the ribbed idol from Knowth, whose parallels are to be found around the mouth of the Tagus in Portugal. It's clear that news of the Boyne Valley mega passage tombs spread far and wide, and they became magnets for what we might term pilgrimages, in which privileged members of society from elsewhere got to join in the religious ceremonies and partake of their own cosmological acquisition. We can see this in Wales and northwest England, for example, as here at Barclodiadi Gowris on Anglesey, where an Irish-style passage tomb, complete with Irish passage tomb art and pins, was built. Nearby at Llanbergoch, a classically Irish-style pot, a so-called Carinated Bowl, was found. People from Scotland were also drawn to the Boyne Valley, copying the sacred symbols on their carved stone bowls, such as this one found at Towie in Aberdeenshire. These objects would have been symbols of power, that is, weapons of social exclusion, as well as being usable as weapons, actual weapons. The spiral design has also turned up on a different kind of symbol of power, an antler mace head found as far away as Norfolk in eastern England. This appropriation of exotic and esoteric symbols is a classic aspect of this power play strategy. And we assume that some of the practices and beliefs that went along with the symbols were also emulated. If, as seems likely at least to me, the spiral was a symbolic representation of the sun's eternal movement across the sky, then it's reasonable to assume that the ceremonies that were adopted also focused on the solstices. It's in Orkney that we see the most ostentatious example of cosmological acquisition involving the Boyne Valley. The prosperous and ambitious farmers on that archipelago, like Irish passage tomb builders, had been engaging in a process of competitive conspicuous consumption focused on the building of bigger and better monuments for their dead since at least as early as 3500 BC. News of the amazing Brunabónia monuments will have reached Orkney thanks to their extensive network of contacts which linked Orkney with Ireland via Scotland's Atlantic coast. The Orkney elite evidently made the killer move in their competitive monument building process by making the long sea journey to the Boyne Valley and then replicating Newgrange at Maes Howe, complete with its cruciform chamber, long passage, and orientation on the midwinter sun, although at Maes Howe it's the setting sun rather than the rising sun that's targeted, probably due to the local topography. They also built similar passage tombs elsewhere in Orkney and included Irish passage tomb designs, albeit giving the spiral a distinctively Orcadian twist, as it were, and as Elizabeth has noted, in their horned spiral design. The spiral appears yet again in Orkney on the distinctive grooved ware pottery that was in use there, as on this famous sherd from Skara Brae, whose design is a pretty good match for that seen on the curbstone at the back of Newgrange, opposite the entrance. Orcadians also emulated the smooth stone bowls seen in Irish passage tombs. The Orkney elite didn't just make long-distance voyages to the Boyne Valley. Thanks to this little critter and its distinctive genetic signature, we can say that they also sailed as far as the continent, probably France or Spain, bringing voles back on the boat as a handy and self-replenishing food supply for the boat journey, because we all know that voles breed like rabbits. Clearly, we know that people did eat them, since the vole bones from Skara Brae show the charring of their extremities that is typical of being stuck on a stick and roasted over a fire. And we also know, this fantastic CT image of a dog coprolite, that's a turd to you and me, that dogs were also eating them. It's clear that these ambitious Orcadian farmers succeeded in creating a new world order featuring themselves on top. They invented a whole new kind of monument, the stone circle enclosed by a henge, as here at the Stones of Stoness. And they probably erected timber circles too. They invented a new style of pottery, flat-based grooved ware. They wore ostentatious, chunky jewellery of materials such as sperm whale ivory and whalebone. And their clothing pins may constitute an Orcadian twist on the long pins of bone and antler seen in Irish passage tombs. And they made an array of weird and wonderful carved stone objects, which were both, again, symbols of power, weapons of social exclusion, and actual weapons. We know this because there are skulls from Orcadian tombs that literally have been bashed in using these kind of things. To judge from the amazing site of Nessa Brodgar, near Maes Howe and the Stones of Stoness, it's clear that Orkney became a magnet for pilgrimages in its own right, rivaling and perhaps even superseding, eclipsing the Boyne Valley. The enormous stone-roofed houses found here could well have accommodated visiting dignitaries from far and wide. And there's a huge midden where, from the waste from their feasting. And the range of items found at the Nessa Brodgar includes exotica such as Arran pitchstone. Clearly, the visitors took away with them the idea of making grooved ware, of building stone and timber circles, and of using Orcadian designs, as you can see from this map that traces just one aspect of this rapid spread, tracing it down the west coast of Scotland. This southward spread of grooved ware pottery and of other features of Orkney elite life is truly astonishing, extending as far as Cornwall, Kent, and southwest Ireland. And of course, we can trace it back to the Boyne Valley as well, with a classic early Orcadian-style grooved ware pot being found along with a miniature Orkney-style mace head in Tomb 6 at Knowth, accompanying cremated bone that's been radiocarbon dated. We can also see it in the small siltstone plaque with an Orcadian-style lozenge design found in the eastern tomb at Knowth, and you can see a comparandum here from Skara Bray. And you can also see it, and Kerry has mentioned this before, in the two tiny beads found at Knowth that are miniature versions of Scottish six-knobbed carved stone balls, like the one you see here from Nessa Brodgar. It also seems likely that the practice of using stone mace heads was adopted in Ireland thanks to these connections with the Orkney elite, as you can see from this pestle mace head found at Knowth and the miniature mace head pendants from Tara. Mace heads were certainly being made at Nessa Brodgar and deliberately broken in Orkney as part of the religious ceremonies there. And it's significant that the Knowth mace head was deliberately broken and indeed burnt in an echo of the Orcadian practice. But Ken and the National Museum of Ireland, you should get, money every time this image is shown, The most intriguing and iconic object from the Boyne Valley is this superlative flint mace head from the eastern tomb at Knowth. And there's so much to say about it that I could fill a whole lecture, but there's no time for that. The point I want to make here is that its design, I would argue, Milad, includes both the Orcadian horn spiral that Elizabeth mentioned, but also an Irish style spiral. And even though you don't get flint of this size and quality occurring naturally in Orkney, I do wonder whether it was actually made in Orkney using imported flint and presented to a visiting VIP from the Boyne Valley during a visit to the Ness of Brodgar as a diplomatic gift to be displayed back home and deposited in a VIP funerary context as a precious exotic treasure. We'll never know, but it's at least a possibility. My time is rapidly coming to an end, and so I aim to cover the developments of the next 12 and a half centuries in a series of snapshots that give you a sense of the changing ways in which Ireland was connected to the outside world. So, case study 4. This concerns Atlantic cup and ring rock art that's found unevenly distributed on stretches of living rock and on boulders from northern Scotland to northwest Spain. This isn't connected with grooved ware designs, and there's much that still needs to be bottomed out about its relationship, if any, with passage to Mart. There is a relationship, but it's too complicated to go into here. Moreover, its dating leaves a lot to be desired, but there's a reasonable chance that it dates to the first half of the 3rd millennium. And what it does show is a continuation or a re-establishment of connections along the Atlantic facade, and a sharing of ritual practices and beliefs, as work by Joanna Valdez-Tullett and Richard Bradley has confirmed. Additional confirmation of a Galician link was recently discovered at Kilmartin Glen in West Scotland, where a unique stretch of bedrock decorated with Galician-style deer designs was found reused in an early Bronze Age kist. Dial forward to around 2400 BC, and links with the continent are strengthened as Ireland gets drawn into the world of the so-called Beaker people. This was when the use of this distinctive continental style pottery and the use of copper and gold was expanding. And we know from DNA work in Britain that beaker users were arriving from different parts of the continent to different parts of Britain, as you can see here. I wrote this before I heard Clearness think, no DNA work has yet been done to my knowledge on beaker-associated human remains in Ireland, except for at Douth Hall. But I think it's safe to assume that new people from the continent were indeed arriving, including those skilled in prospecting for and mining copper. They opened a copper mine on Ross Island in County Kerry, and I love what Mary pointed out about the source of the origin of the arbutus, northern Spain, why not? All the evidence points towards people coming from the Atlantic facade rather than from Central and Northern Europe, which explains why Ireland has next to no single beaker graves like the ones that are so common in Britain. Indeed, we may be dealing, in part, with people coming in from Brittany and choosing to signal and memorialize their identity by building wedge-shaped megalithic tombs that harked back to ancient funerary traditions back home. Dial forward now to the early Bronze Age, and from around 2200 BC. By now, copper from Ross Island will have been circulated in Ireland and exported to Britain and perhaps also Brittany for several generations. Interactions with Britain were massively boosted when continental prospectors discovered tin and also gold in Cornwall around 2200 BC. Both metals were exported to southwest Ireland, where the tin was alloyed with copper to make bronze, and the gold was made into the lunarly, about which Mary has so eloquently spoken before. Stuart Needham has outlined the pattern of the flow of Irish metal, and it's clear that those people who were able to control its flow got rich quick. This is certainly the case with Kilmartin Glen in the west of Scotland, near the southern end of the Great Glen, the main route up to a major metalworking centre in northeast Scotland. The entrepreneurial elite in Kilmartin, who got their metal supplies from Ireland, built a series of ostentatious funerary mounds along the bottom of the glen, and in one of these they carved images of the source of their wealth, that is, the flat metal axe heads that they were trading, onto a pre-existing slab of rock bearing ancient Atlantic rock art motifs, and they used it as the capstone of their kist. They also obtained fine Irish-style pots, and even got a potter to make a curious hybrid. The top part is a classic Irish bowl food vessel, but the four stumpy little feet are characteristic of food vessels in Yorkshire. God's own country, I have to say. Another area with which they were connected, as they were using their wealth to acquire fine Whitby jet spacer plate necklaces, which were skeuomorphs of Irish gold lunarly. I end this talk with what's likely to have been yet another example of the phenomenon of long-distance elite travel for cosmological acquisition, this time dating to around 1750 BC. It concerns this intriguing individual who is buried in the mound of the Neolithic passage tomb of the Mound of the Hostages at Tara, which would have been a very special and exclusive place of burial. This one's for you, Murish, and also for you, Neil, as it concerns Stonehenge, the topic of your next presentation. Stonehenge had long attracted visitors from far and wide, just as Orkney and Bruneboyne had done. And from 2000 BC onwards, when new sources of copper were being mined in Ireland and Britain, and when the tin supply system was reorganised, the area around Stonehenge seems to have become a centre for the ostentatious display of wealth and power, especially in the burial of the dead. One person who's likely to have travelled there from Ireland is this individual. Excavated in the 1950s and osteologically identified as a young man, this person was buried with female trappings. One for Joe. A composite necklace made from faience, bronze, amber, and jet. A bronze awl, and a little knife or razor, like a Phillips lady shave, much slenderer than male razors of the time. Isotopic analysis revealed that this individual had not been raised in the Tara area, but probably somewhere else in Ireland. The composite necklace, with its variety of precious materials, may well have been attributed special powers and worn as an amulet, thereby making this a kind of supernatural power dressing, if you like. It's a type of high-status female artifact that was particularly popular in the Stonehenge area, while in contrast, such necklaces are very rare in Ireland. Indeed, it may be that individual components such as the amber and jet beads were obtained in Wessex. There remain many questions about this person, not least that of biological sex, which is being investigated further now. But for now, Tara Boy remains an international person of mystery who reminds us once again of the capacity that certain members of society had to undertake long-distance journeys and to engage with the wider world outside of Ireland. So thanks for listening, and back to you, Owen.